right, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So in this talk, just want to sort of do a little exploration of the vow that we will say right after this talk, that beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Of course, this is one of the fundamental bodhisattva vows, and we say it a lot. And I think we spend some time thinking about it. You know, Hojo-san writes about it in his various works, but really, sort of fundamentally, like why is it that we say this? Because we know that there are some issues with it, right? We can't save all beings, and we know this. We talked about this a lot. But you know, there are something like 1 trillion species, it's estimated, if you include all organisms on Earth. And if we start counting individuals, you know, just sentient animals, that is excluding plants, fungi, bacteria, archaea, you know, the estimate that I was able to find is a quintillion, which is a number so big that we don't know what it means. So it's a billion for reference, if you billion times a billion. But yeah, we're basically familiar with this aspect of the vow, that it's impossible, but we vow to sort of work in that direction. Even though we know we can't fulfill it, we'll still aim in that direction. But another sort of interesting aspect of this vow is, you know, if we're honest with ourselves, I think we don't really want to save all beings. If we're really honest, there are some beings that we really don't like, whether it be sort of particular people that we find to be very evil. What about mosquitoes, for example? I think most of us don't want to save mosquitoes or cockroaches or spiders or snakes, depending on your particular predilections. Animals that form part of our diets, you know, we're obviously not saving them. So, you know, there are plenty of beings that we'd sooner kill, which is something we also vow not to do, than save, which we do vow to do. So, you know, there's another kind of contradiction here. And then the question is this a problem for us? And to do that, I think, you know, we need to kind of take a deep dive into what this vow is really saying. So to start, the original language, you know, it's written in Chinese, and we use a translated version, is Shuzhou Muhen Seigando. So to unpack that a little bit, the first two characters, the Shuzhou part, literally means sort of like all, and then it's the character for kind of life, a word that can mean like to live, or to be born, depending on the context. But in this context, like that word as a translation of Sanskrit stuff means all sentient beings. It's referring specifically to sentient beings rather than plants or rocks or sand or water or something like that. So the original intention was all sentient beings. The second part, the seigan, is literally those characters. The first one means like vow, and the second one means something like wish or prayer. And together they just mean to vow. It's a pretty straightforward word. There isn't too much ambiguity there. The final word, though, is sort of where I think we can get into a little bit of trouble with the English translation, and that is the do, which actually means to ferry, like to ferry someone across a river. It doesn't mean to save or free in the normal sense. I mean, it has that connotation, but it's a little bit of an inaccurate translation. And this is used because historically in Buddhism, you know, the Buddha would often use river metaphors to talk about crossing over from samsara to nirvana. So on one shore you have samsara, and then through your Buddhist practice, which is sort of like a raft, you cross the river and enter nirvana on the other side. So the original intention of the vow then is to help sentient beings attain nirvana. It doesn't mean to, save something from being killed necessarily, although that could be part of bringing it along to nirvana. But it explicitly doesn't mean something like saving a forest or saving a coral reef. Well, maybe a coral reef. I don't know if you can count corals as sentient. Probably not, but maybe. So basically, it's focusing on sentient things, not inanimate things. But we can do sort of a Dogen style reading of this word, I think, and come up with some interesting implications. So although this shujo normally means sentient being, like I said, the actual sort of word is all life. So the second word, can mean just life. Or it can be all arising. When we talk about arising and perishing, or birth and death, in Buddhism, it's the same character that's used for the arising or being born. And so life and arising obviously go a bit beyond sentience, right? There are many aspects of our life, our reality, that are not necessarily sentient. And certainly there are things that arise that are not sentient either. So nowadays, for example, we'd include plants in the category of life for sure. Like they weren't included as sentient beings previously. And more broadly, we can talk about sort of the world as a dynamic living system. And Dogen, of course, talked about the insentient preaching the Dharma. So in this understanding, it would seem that they don't even need to be ferried to the other side because they're already the ones preaching the truth of reality to us. But if we look a little bit further at what Dogen thinks about reality, we don't even have a river to cross in his understanding of samsara and nirvana, because they're fundamentally the same thing, interconnected. Like Hojo-san says, 5 fingers versus 1 hand, they're both already there. I don't have to cross anything to change from 5 fingers to 1 hand, So if both shores are the same, what is it that we have to cross? And who are we taking from one side to the other, and how are we going to do that? So, in Dogen's conception, we just spent a Genzo talking about Buddha nature, which Dogen doesn't see as something that's like sort of a spark inside of you that you kind of can nurture and become a Buddha at some later time. Buddha nature is reality itself. And it's through this reality that we live in that nirvana is expressed as well. Instead, Dogen's practice is about sort of actualizing that reality. So the Buddha nature is already here. It's never hidden, he says, but what we do in our practice is we actualize that reality. Okay, so another way of understanding vow then is a vow to actualize nirvana through our practice, if we take Dogen's sort of view of things. When we take the, what he calls the backward step that turns the light inward in Fukan Zazengi, we add the kind of quiet and calm nirvanic perspective to our normal samsaric one. So when we sit in Zazen, we have both kind of the nirvanic side and the samsaric side there together, right? So our mind is still going, that's the samsara side, but we're taking a backward step and stepping away from it and kind of seeing it from a little bit of a detached view. And so that's kind of the nirvanic perspective, where we, are ineffably connected with all beings. Of course, it's hard to truly sort of put into words and understand. But the important point is, samsara doesn't really go away, but we have access to this new approach to reality that goes beyond just our normal self-serving way of being. And it's said that, when we do Zazen, all of the kind of boundless life on earth becomes nirvana. There was some point in the Genzue where, Hojo-san was discussing this passage about zazen actually enlightening everyone, not just the individual sitting. So through this practice, the whole universe, becomes nirvana. And he was sort of saying, I don't really believe this literally, and that's kind of obvious, I think, because obviously our practice here isn't going to change someone else's perspective on the other side of the globe, for example. They're still going to be seeing the world from their perspective in the same way. But insofar as, we are fully interconnected with all of reality, and we, from our perspective, are seeing it that way, the whole universe is awakened in that moment. But the important part of our practice, I think, is not so much just seeing that, Dogen says in Shobogenzo Zui Monkey that, you can do zazen so much that you break a hole in the floor, but if you don't have, the proper bodhisattva orientation, the mind of awakening, your practice is a waste of time, basically. And I think what this means is we really need to take this perspective that we see in zazen and apply it to our actual lives. So one of the things that was also mentioned in this Genzue is that we have to basically apply the formless reality of zazen to our lives of form. And what this sort of means is we're taking this ineffable perspective of interconnection and then doing something in our actual normal samsaric life that sort of applies what we learned from that experience of interconnection. So just to do zazen on its own is not enough. We need to actually learn from it. Uchiyama Roshi said that zazen is the one true teacher. And if all we're doing is sort of self-indulgently sitting and gazing at our navel, we're not learning anything from the practice. Another way that Uchiyama Roshi talked about this character, this life character, is the sense of raw. So in Japanese, the same character read in a different pronunciation means raw or uncooked or fresh. Or in the case of beer, it means draft beer, which is not sentient and doesn't really assist sentience, but just as an aside. So Uchiyama Roshi used this sense of rawness to talk about reality before we cook it with our minds. So he would say that, there's this raw reality out there, but we can't help ourselves but to cook it with our minds and come up with things that we like or don't like, and our different biases and so forth. Part of what we're doing in our zazen is, again, we're taking a step back from that cooking action that's going on in our brain, right? The cooking's still happening, but we kind of step out of the pot, so to speak. And we see the cooking from the outside without kind of attaching to it. So if we use this meaning, we can say, our vow could be something like, the rawness of reality is limitless. I vow to see it and center my life on it. So as I mentioned before, the original meaning of the vow, is really just to help sentient beings attain nirvana. And, as such, it wouldn't directly apply to helping plants grow. And it's also not, always entirely clear how we can help a non-human sentient being get closer to nirvana, It makes sense in the context of rebirth, if we have that belief, doing something that might help a non-sentient being attain, a favorable rebirth in which it can become awakened, that might make sense. But if we don't have that viewpoint, it becomes a little bit less clear. But again, I think if we look at some of these deeper meanings of what this vow might mean, that sort of understanding of how we might help a non-sentient being or a sentient animal that isn't human, how we might help vary it, so to speak. So sanghas, I think that the concept of sangha is really interesting. I think in a previous talk I mentioned how, it used to mean something like a guild. And, if you think of like a guild, they have sort of a special, a trade guild or something. All these people are sort of working together to do, a particular thing. And maybe they're like talking together to set their prices and that sort of thing. And, they have sort of a bond through what they do. And sanghas are also just sort of like a mini society, Obviously, ours here in Bloomington is very small, but historically, there were some pretty big sanghas out there. And all societies sort of operate on some form of consensus, like there's a generally shared set of values that set the norm for behavior and what's acceptable and what isn't. And, currently our broader society core set of values, encourages a lot of the problems that we face as a society. And, we face a lot of these problems in large part due to our indifference to other beings, both sentient and non-sentient. So the important part here, though, is that, well, I guess I should say too, that like, one of the things that society encourages us to do is sort of like fairy stuff just to ourselves, The idea is we're not really ferrying anyone else unless we really have to. The sort of core value is like, how can I ferry as much wealth and stuff to myself as possible, while mostly disregarding others. But the Sangha's consensus is, fundamentally different, of course. As we know, the Buddha pointed out early on that self-indulgence is a primary source of suffering. And the consensus of Sangha is that unlike normal society, we try to help our fellow humans see and treat the world as nirvana. That's, especially as Soto Zen Buddhists. And I think that if people take that perspective, they see that all beings, sentient or not, include our one interconnected reality. And once you have that view, beings cease to sort of be just objects that are there to enrich ourselves, but they're actually part of our own bodies, our larger sort of dharma body, so to speak. And they should be cherished and nourished. And I think the more people we bring into this right view, the more we can save non-sentient beings from greedy destruction, by people just trying to get what they want out of, so-called natural resources and so forth. So the idea here is not like a vision of, gaining converts just for the sake of, increasing our own sangha to say that it's big or powerful or something. But, I think really from the conviction that this view is a healthy one, and, people should be, not obviously like forced or anything, but, I think just through our example, if people see that what we as a sangha are doing is positive, that they would want to take that on as well, and this kind of circle of influence expands and expands, which I think is beneficial for all beings. So I think though the challenge of our sangha in the current age is to truly take this vow to heart to save all beings. The sangha is no longer very set apart from regular society. And as a result, it's very easy for people to bring kind of worldly views into the sangha and then like sort of think or twist things to make it seem like that's a Buddhist view. So I think we have to be really careful with this. What are we doing here? Like, why are we engaged in this practice? Is it just to sort of carry on things that we already know that are unhealthy for ourselves, or to somehow like convince us of that, or is it to do something that's fundamentally different and for the good of everyone? So is it a problem then, that we may not really want to save all beings all the time? Obviously we should aspire in that direction, but we also need to recognize that we're samsaric beings. Even if through zazen, we can have this sort of glimpse of nirvana, and then hopefully carry it into our daily lives to a certain extent. We're still, bound by a lot of karma, and depending on our particular circumstances and backgrounds, we don't all have the capacity to be, ideal bodhisattvas all the time. And I think we need to forgive ourselves, when we mess up. And this is also why we have, both vow and repentance, right? So we have these strong, heavy vows, and we're always going to fall short, but we have repentance there to get back on track, but also not beat ourselves up about it. So I think that for me, the way that I've always understood Buddhism is it's sort of like somewhere at the middle ground between self-improvement and self-acceptance. Like I think maybe early Buddhism was much more like self-improvement, like I'm going to become sort of almost like this superhuman, perfect being. But as the history went on, I think that a stronger element of self-acceptance has come into the mix, and I think that part is really important. So in Soto Zen, we have the concept of personal vows in addition to these standard set of vows that we repeat. And this is sort of to recognize the fact that we have different strengths and weaknesses. So, Hojo-san's personal vow has basically been to carry on Uchiyama Roshi's personal vow. And I don't know if you've had a chance to look at this book. The introduction was written by Hojo-san, and he sort of lays out the personal vows of a number of Soto Zen practitioners over the generations. And this is what he describes personal vows as. So he says, talking about the standard set of 4 that we'll recite after this talk, he says, "These are boundless and endless vows. At no time can we say that we have completely accomplished all of these vows, at least within this lifetime. Therefore, our practice is also endless. For us, these general vows are directions towards which we need to walk one step at a time. Based on these 4 vows, we need to take our own personal vows. As the bodhisattva, that is the Shakyamuni in his past lives, did in each of his 500 lifetimes, depending on who he was and what he could do to help other beings." So that is, if you look at these old stories of the Buddha being born into different bodies as different beings, each time he would have a different vow depending on what he could do in that particular instance. So each of us has a unique personality and capability depending on who we are and the situation in which we live, and that's the context in which we take our personal vows. Let's see, what else do I have on here? Okay, I'll come back to this in a second. So Hojo-san's vow has been to carry on Uchiyama Roshi's vow, which was to basically try to inculcate, people to be diligent zazen practitioners, and then also to translate and comment on works of our ancestors so that we can understand what zazen means. And as we all know, he's incredibly diligent and single-minded in this task. And I think that this makes him a really good role model and a teacher in this regard. But I think it's also important, to recognize that we don't all share his particular circumstances, background, and orientation. There's a story that I've mentioned several times that Uchiyama Roshi was really enamored with Sawaki Roshi, who was his teacher, and Uchiyama Roshi was sort of sickly and kind of nerdy and not very strong, and Sawaki is just sort of like the sort of stereotypical Zen master, like full of vitality and extremely well-spoken and confident and everything. And so, early in his practice, Uchiyama Roshi asked Sawaki Roshi, if I do enough zazen, will I be like you? And, Sawaki Roshi kind of like laughed and was like, of course you're not going to be me. Like, this is just my personality. It has nothing to do with my practice. This is just kind of how I was born. I was like this before I started practicing. And, Uchiyama Roshi goes on to say that, a violet blooms as a violet and a rose blooms as a rose. You can't force a violet to bloom as a rose. And so, in the case of Hojo-san, we don't all need to be renowned translators or sit Rohatsu Sesshin every year of our lives, in order to say that we've done our best to carry out our vows. We have different capacities. So very shortly after I became a priest, which is like 5 years ago now, it's hard to believe. We were all asked to write a chapter in this book about personal vows. And, I haven't looked back at this at all since then. But I wrote a chapter called My Absurd Vow, in which I sort of, compared the vows that we take as Buddhists to the sort of Western philosophical idea of absurdism with Camus. And I talked specifically about his Myth of Sisyphus essay, in which he basically says that, life is sort of like, pushing this boulder up a hill, even knowing that it's going to roll back down. And so how do we find meaning if that's kind of our life, if we're just pushing a boulder up and we know we'll ultimately never really accomplish anything because it's just going to kind of roll back in our face and we have to repeat it all over again. So what I wrote, I'll just read it to you all, the final sort of conclusion paragraph of the essay. So in this essay, I sort of was basically kind of making excuses for myself and being like, yeah, I'm a lazy guy and it's hard for me to, get in to do zazen and, and so forth. So I said, normally Zen is seen as a difficult practice that few would be willing to undertake. I do not think that this view is necessarily incorrect, but for me, it's a difficult practice that I cannot help but to undertake, despite the fact that I may not be especially well suited to it. Just as Sisyphus, proud and devious, was by design not the appropriate person to carry out his task, from which there was no escape and no glory, I similarly lack the single-mindedness that Dogen praises so highly in Zen practice. So, Dogen is always saying in Zui Monkey, for example, that we have to be, single-minded in our Buddhist practice and don't do like anything else at all, like just focus on Zen. And, that was always disheartening to me because I always kind of go from one interest to another really fast, and I'm sort of the classic like jack of all trades, master of none kind of person. So I'm kind of the opposite of what Dogen praises. Nonetheless, like Camus' version of Sisyphus, here is where I must stand in defiance of my karma and state the only personal vow I can think to make. So in Camus' story, Sisyphus sort of finds meaning in continuing to push up this boulder in defiance, because this is a punishment for him from the gods. So in defiance of the gods, he says, I'm gonna find meaning in this, despite the fact that you kind of don't want me to, basically. And this is his general philosophy of absurdism is basically that life is absurd in the sense that there is no inherent meaning to it, and the options that we sort of have is like we can kill ourselves, in which case that seems even more absurd because we're just sort of totally giving up, or we can kind of like find meaning in something that isn't really meaningful and just sort of pretend that it's meaningful, or we can just sort of accept that life is absurd but make it meaningful nonetheless. So that's what I was saying here about Sisyphus is standing in defiance. So like Camus' version of Sisyphus, here I must stand in defiance of my karma and state the only personal vow I can think to make. I vow to keep practicing despite whatever current might be flowing against me. I vow to take up the burden of the rock when it rolls back down the hill, regardless of how long I might drag my feet on the way back down. I vow to keep showing up to the Zendo, even if I sleep through a full week of early morning zazen. I vow to find serenity within the realm of human failure. I vow to continue to embrace our absurd practice, because to do otherwise is the only thing that would be more absurd. And it's a bit embarrassing because I haven't been coming to morning zazen for a long time. So I haven't stopped doing zazen, though. I still do zazen, so that's good. But at any rate, the reason that I wanted to explore all of this today is because I just took a new job that's going to be a full-time job at the Sycamore Land Trust, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with what that is, a land trust is sort of well, the most sort of famous example is the Nature Conservancy. So if you know what they do, you'd have an idea. But basically, they sort of it's a nonprofit that buys land and protects it. Because obviously our government doesn't have the resources or really the will to do this on kind of a grand scale. So it's kind of a way of individuals who think that this is a good thing taking up that cause. And I did go into this, pretty self-consciously as a component of practice, not just wanting to do something different. I think that non-sentient, or maybe not non-sentient, but non-human beings are very often neglected. We spend most of our practice as Buddhists obviously focused on humans, and for good reason. I think that, like I was saying, it's ultimately humans that decide what happens to the natural world. For better or worse, we have kind of dominion over everything at this point. So it is very important, I think, to engage with humans, but I'm also not especially well suited to it. I'm kind of a misanthropic person, and but on the other hand, I have a long kind of background with plants and animals, and I've always loved kind of doing things that can foster life in that way. And so with this new job, I'll have the opportunity to do that every day. And so, I'm seeing that as an evolution of my personal vow. When I wrote this, I really didn't know what to write. I think the essay turned out okay, but I didn't really feel, like I was. I felt like it was a little non-committal. It didn't really include anything other than sort of a basic commitment to practice, which obviously we should all have anyways. So as I've explored my practice as a priest, I'm sort of finding that that's a natural fit for my particular background and capabilities. And so this job will sort of be a way to learn these techniques and also to do something that I think is directly positive, but also I think in the future I'd like to try to pull it into a more explicit practice direction. I haven't fully articulated what that will look like, but that's sort of my provisional personal vow for now, is to work with non-human beings to ferry them somewhere good. So with that, I think I'll conclude. And yeah, thank you very much. So any thoughts or comments, questions? Yeah, Mark.
So first of all, well, thanks for sharing what you wrote on about. I love the way you actually kind of wrote that relationship to Camus and Sisyphus. I thought that was really beautifully done. So it's makes me want to go and leaf through that book a little bit. But one of the things that kind of strikes me in all this kind of discussion on the I vow to save all beings, and one of the things, especially if we're kind of looking at our practice as trying to be able to kind of bring together these worlds of form and emptiness, then what is the I that's vowing to save all beings? And so when we make this vow, there's a part of me that's always kind of thinking about it as this individual, Mark Fraley, vowing to save all beings, and then there's all the total dynamic functioning of the universe itself filling out this vow, which is also never going to end, or the universe acting through me as an individual in that vow to save all beings. And so when I'm thinking about what it actually means to be an I that saves all beings, I'm never really actually sure what that means, but it feels right anyway. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, or if you can elaborate.
Yeah, well, the Chinese circumvents this problem because they don't require a subject in the sentence, so it actually doesn't say I anywhere. It just says, beings are numberless, vow to bury them. Yeah, I mean, I think that and I think that speaking of karma, and Hojo-san says this, his karma as a Japanese person, means that he thinks in a Japanese way based on his upbringing and his language and so forth. And for us, it's I wonder if maybe this insistence on a subject in every sentence increases our self-indulgence somehow. Like we always have to say I. But in Chinese and Japanese, it can go unstated. And I think that's obviously the case here. But it's an interesting point nonetheless, and I think that, of course, from that nirvanic perspective, there is no I, there is no self, which is a fundamental truth of Buddhism. But at the same time, this samsaric side isn't invalidated by that, right? Both are true. So we do have this body and this mind that is provisionally called I, that has to function out in the world in this particular skin bag, So I think both are there. We don't need to reject the I just because we also have this interconnected perspective, and I think that that's what Dogen is always harping on is we have I think the way the language is just so fundamental. It has to be fundamentally kind of dualistic. But really, the truth of Buddhism to Dogen is that both things that seem completely contradictory are true at the same time. So I think that that's what Dogen is always reminding us. Whenever you set up a dualism, you always have to kind of break it down and think about it and be like, well, maybe both of these things are actually true simultaneously. So.
Thank you.
Anything else this morning I'd say?
I was just wondering, when you started out talking about the 4 vows, I was kind of wondering if we know when that particular formulation arose. Was it in China, or do you know?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it predates that. I didn't look into that as I prepared for the talk, but Hojo-san talks about it in Living by Vow. I remember sort of flipping through it not too long ago. And there's an older version that's less kind of paradoxical in nature and more just kind of direct. Like just sort of, I vow to save sentient beings rather than they're numberless and I vow to save them, something like that. And I think that it comes, my guess at least, is that it comes from India in, kind of the, probably, middle of the sort of Mahayana period of development. I don't think that it was crafted in China, but I could be wrong. I'd have to check that. But there is at least an older version, so this is like an updated version of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
So I recently read an essay by Uchiyama Roshi where he was talking about what he called, or what at least was translated as genuine religion. What he called genuine religion.
Yeah, no, that's I actually wrote a paper about it.
Okay, good. I'm wondering about it. So in that essay he talks about, for a religion to be what he calls a genuine religion, it has to be universal. So it has to be kind of universally available. And or the English is, the word that's used is salvation, that there's within the religion, salvation is available to all. And he specifically talks about Dogen's Shikantaza Zazen as something, a practice that is universal, and we hear that in Fukan Zazengi. That's, it's universally recommended to all beings, and that specific, and the reason that Zazen in that way is universal is, if I understand it right, is because it's not goal oriented. Because when you're just sitting, if there were a goal to your sitting, then some would be further on towards that goal than others. So some are sort of better than others.
Mm-hmm.
Some are lower. Some are have attained something that others have not. And whereas within Shikantaza Zazen, there is just, we're all somehow sitting on the same field as practitioners. But then I also think about if in our sitting, I think Uchiyama Roshi also says we're sitting with all beings.
Mm-hmm.
So we're sitting with each other in the Zendo, and somehow we're also sitting with all beings. And so I was thinking about, am I on the right track with that so far?
That sounds right.
So I was thinking about all that, and then thinking about, so Zazen is this universally available practice, and he also calls it Zazen without class distinction.
Mm-hmm.
That's the translation.
Mm-hmm.
But I think about like the practice specifically that we do here, 14-hour-a-day sitting periods. We're going to be in Rohatsu in a couple of weeks where, for 8 days we're doing nothing but sitting and staring at the wall. So supposedly we're doing this universally available practice, but it sort of feels like not that many people could do that.
Yeah.
So it's like, in a way, it seems to create like, oh, these are the people who can do such a difficult practice.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder what your perspective is on that. And although I am surprised sometimes at some of the people that come to Sesshin, I'm like, wow, I wouldn't have expected with your personality that you would be willing to just sit for 14 hours, So how do you see that? The kind of, it feels like this practice specifically is kind of asking a lot of us. We gotta like study this extremely difficult writing and do this difficult sitting practice and go and save all beings in the world, and who can really, so that's that kind of contradiction.
Yeah, thank you. So, there's a lot there. But, as I recall in that essay, he compares Soto Zen and Rinzai Zen, right? And he says that in Rinzai Zen, because they have this koan curriculum that only some people can, attain the, what do they call it? Yeah, Inca, where you get, sort of certification as having passed the whole koan curriculum, that it's a practice sort of for masters, that only, and I think there, only a handful of people in Japan actually ever get this Inca certification. So he argues that it's not universal on that basis, but that Soto Zazen is because we don't have any particular goal, we don't need to attain anything in our practice. And I actually the stuff that I wrote about, just kind of as an aside, is sort of unrelated to the question. But I took a class that it was about kind of the meaning of religion, and it was taught by a classics person, and he was looking at how religion was talked about in ancient Greece and ancient Rome and how it evolved over time, and so I wrote this essay to look at how Uchiyama Roshi understood that word religion. So it was kind of more technical. But, and I think what he's trying to do there is, the phrase shukyo in Japanese is what's translated as religion, but it has sort of a different flavor, and I think we've talked about this before. So, most, to give an example that I think I was mentioning to you all the other day, when I stayed with my friend's father, he had a butsudan, like a Buddhist altar in his house because his wife had died, and that's sort of a thing that you often do after a loved one dies, is you kind of memorialize them in this altar. And it's very explicitly religious. It has, in his case, it was a Pure Land Buddhist thing, so it had, an image of Shinran and an image of the Buddha. It's very kind of ornate, and having already been studying religion, I sort of asked him, I was like, oh, do you think of yourself as a religious person? He was like, oh, no, no, no. And I was like, well, you have this altar in your house. You don't think that that's religion? He was like, no, that's tradition, not religion. Like it's a different thing. Which I thought was very interesting because, of course, if you had some kind of like Catholic shrine in your house, you would probably, be immediately marked as religious in our culture in the way we understand religion, but it's a little bit different over there. So I think that he was kind of, in a sense, also combating this view of religion as sort of only for people that are a little bit out there, maybe. But at any rate, to come back to the question, I think that there's a cultural issue also with practice. I mean, this is sort of the way that I see it, is kind of like, how is it that people like Hojo-san can do this kind of practice so single-mindedly? And why is it that there seem to be many fewer Americans that are willing to kind of sign up for it in the same way? And I think that there's this phrase that's kind of a problematic phrase in Japanese called Yamato Damashi, which is like sort of like the Japanese spirit, and it was sort of used in World War II and stuff. So that's why it's problematic. But I remember this anecdote that I heard on the radio. There was a TV show that they had in Japan in the 90s, I think. And they took this guy and I guess he signed up for it, but what they did is they stripped him naked and put him in this empty apartment, and he was being filmed all the time, and they gave him a bunch of magazines, and he had to survive off winning sweepstakes from these magazines. He only had water, he didn't have any food. And this was all televised, and this was something that you would watch and kind of laugh at. And he did this for over a year, I think, and he just didn't have any clothes for the first several months, and barely had any food a lot of the time. And the American, he was being interviewed by an American radio program about this, and they were like, "Did you try to escape?" And he was like, "Oh no, the door was unlocked. I could have left at any time." And I think that there's sort of a cultural value in Japan that we kind of don't really have, which is to really stick with what you're doing. And I think it's really instilled pretty strongly. I mean, of course, it's not universally that way, but when I compare myself to Hojo-san, I'm just I can't do, I can't devote myself in the same way that you can. I don't know why that is, but for me, it's difficult to fully just give myself up to the practice, and I think it must have something to do with my karma. I mean, I know I'm making excuses for myself, but there has to be some reason. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of a problem in our lineage that we have this super intensive attitude, and that we don't really provide an alternative or really discuss it that much, because I think that, and I mean, there are a lot of other places that one could go in the US where you don't have to practice so intensively, but we don't really have much on offer for people who don't want to engage in sort of this more intensive side of practice. So in my personal view, I think that maybe we should do more to make this practice more universal in terms of just getting people to do a little bit of zazen, because I think the universality is in the practice itself, right? As soon as you sit down on the cushion, it's already there. So it doesn't matter, how long you do it. Of course, the longer the better probably, but I think doing it at all is the important part. So in my view, it's good to have this practice available for the people who want to do it, but we shouldn't treat it like the way that practice has to be for everyone, zazen still has meaning, even if you don't do, an Ushiyama Roshi style sesshin. So that's my view, but others might differ. Anything else? Anything from people online? All right, should we go ahead and wrap up?